There is a peculiar kind of silence that follows the departure of a narcissist. It is not the peaceful silence of a quiet morning, nor the sacred hush one feels in a cathedral before dawn. It is a haunted silence, crowded with echoes. The slammed doors still tremble in memory. The cruel words continue pacing the corridors of the mind long after the speaker has vanished. One finds oneself sitting in the ruins of affection, wondering whether love had truly lived there at all, or whether one had merely mistaken hunger for devotion and manipulation for intimacy. The narcissist leaves with astonishing confidence. That is perhaps the first wound. They do not depart like ordinary men and women who carry regret in their luggage. They leave with the cold certainty of a conqueror riding away from a city already burned. In their mind, you were not a soul to be cherished but a mirror to be used. And once the mirror ceased reflecting the image they desired, they believed they could simply cast it aside and walk onward untouched. What they never expected, what they are almost constitutionally incapable of imagining, is that the discarded soul might rise. For the narcissist understands possessio, end but not transformation. They understand performance but not redemption. They know how to imitate affection with unnerving precision, but they do not comprehend the mysterious strength that suffering can awaken in a wounded heart. And so when they leave, they assume the story is over. But it is only beginning. There is a strange arrogance in those who believe they are the authors of another person's worth. The narcissist often imagines that your joy began with them and therefore must perish without them. They expect devastation to become your permanent climate. They imagine your days reduced to endless mourning, your confidence withered, your spirit bent forever beneath the memory of their rejection. In truth, they rely upon this belief. It feeds them. The idea that someone remains broken because of them becomes proof, in their own distorted reasoning, that they were powerful, significant, unforgettable. Yet power founded upon fear is always weaker than it appears. A tyrant may command trembling subjects for a season, but he cannot command the sunrise. In the same way, the narcissist may dominate emotions for a time, but they cannot indefinitely imprison a soul that has been begged to seek truth, and healing is precisely that, the slow rediscovery of truth. Not the shallow slogans men repeat to avoid pain, nor the fashionable optimism that evaporates at the first sign of suffering. Real healing is sterner than that. It is a difficult pilgrimage through valleys one never wished to enter. It demands that a person sit honestly with grief instead of decorating it with distractions. It asks hard questions. Why did I tolerate cruelty? Why did I confuse longing with love? Why did I apologize for wounds I did not create? Why did I shrink myself so another could feel large? These are not comfortable questions. Indeed, most people spend entire lifetimes fleeing from them. But the wounded soul who dares to confront them begins to change in ways the narcissist cannot predict. For pain, when faced truthfully, ceases to be merely pain. It becomes revelation. At first, the transformation is almost invisible. One merely notices that the mornings no longer feel quite as unbearable. The name that once struck like thunder now passes through the mind with less violence. The desperate urge to explain oneself fades. One begins to laugh again, though the laughter arrives too late. Idly like a bird returning after a storm. Then comes the more unsettling discovery. One realizes that peace had been absent long before the narcissist departed. How extraordinary that realization is. The victim often spends months grieving the loss of someone who had already been stealing their serenity day by day. They mourn chains because the chains had become familiar. Human beings are peculiar creatures in this regard. We can grow accustomed to misery provided it arrives consistently enough. The soul adapts itself to starvation and begins calling it devotion, but healing strips away illusion. The healed person begins remembering not only the rare moments of affection, but also the exhausting cycles of manipulation, the subtle humiliations, the endless need to earn tenderness that ought to have been freely given. They remember how every disagreement became an accusation against their character, how every vulnerability was eventually weaponized, how they walked on invisible glass, measuring every word, fearing emotional punishment for crimes they could never fully understand. And suddenly the discard no longer appears as pure tragedy. It begins, however painfully, to bleed deliverance. This is the moment the narcissist never anticipates. They expect your suffering to preserve their importance forever. But healing performs a quiet miracle. It removes them from the throne of your inner world, not through hatred, strangely enough, but through clarity. Hatred still grants significance to its object, Obsession, even negative obsession, remains a kind of bondage. The truly healed soul no longer burns with the frantic need for revenge, because revenge implies continued captivity. No, healing does something far more devastating to the narcissist's fantasy of superiority. It makes them irrelevant. One must understand how intolerable this becomes for such individuals. The narcissist does not merely desire admiration, they require centrality. To them, being forgotten is a kind of annihilation. Their ego survives by occupying emotional territory inside other people. Whether through affection, fear, guilt, or confusion matters little. What matters is remaining psychologically dominant. But your healing quietly evicts them. You cease rehearsing old conversations in the courtroom of your mind. You stop craving explanations from someone incapable of honesty. Why? You no longer feel compelled to prove your goodness to a person determined to misunderstand you. And in that freedom, something remarkable occurs. Your identity begins returning. Not the frightened identity shaped by survival, but the deeper self buried beneath years of emotional negotiation. You remember what delighted you before anxiety became your companion. You rediscover opinions once silenced to avoid conflict. You speak without rehearsing. You rest without fear. You make decisions without waiting for emotional permission. Piece by piece, the soul returns to itself like a kingdom reclaimed after occupation. The narcissist may hear rumors of this transformation through mutual acquaintances or fleeting glimpses from afar. They may learn that you are smiling again, building again, living again, and though they will rarely confess it openly, such news unsettles them more deeply than rage ever could. For your healing exposes a truth they desperately wish to deny. You were never dependent upon them for your worth. Indeed, it was often the reverse. Many narcissists construct their identities by consuming the vitality of others. They borrow admiration because they cannot get, and generate self-respect. They harvest attention because silence forces them to confront the terrifying emptiness within. This is why they move from relationship to relationship with such restless urgency. They are forever searching for another audience, another caretaker, another mirror polished bright enough to hide their fractures. But the healed person no longer participates in this illusion. And here lies the bitter irony. The narcissist discarded you believing they were abandoning weakness, only to discover they had abandoned the very source of stability they secretly relied upon. Meanwhile, the one discarded begins growing stronger, not quickly. Real healing is rarely dramatic. It unfolds in ordinary moments. Choosing not to answer the manipulative message, sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, enjoying an afternoon without emotional dread, learning that solitude can nourish instead of terrify, discovering that one's value does not fluctuate according to another person's moods. These victories appear small to the outside world, but heaven often works through small things. A forest begins with seeds invisible beneath the soil, and perhaps this is why the Narcissists cannot comprehend your recovery. They mistake loudness for strength. They believe dominance is power. They imagine control to be the highest form of influence. Yet genuine strength is quieter. It does not need constant applause. It does not feed upon submission. It endures. There is a profound difference between being feared and being respected, between being desired and being trusted, between commanding attention and deserving love. The narcissist spends years pursuing the former while neglecting the latter, and thus they often arrive at the end of relationships bewildered by their own loneliness. For eventually people grow weary of performing emotional labor for someone who never truly sees them. The healed person begins to understand another difficult truth as well. The narcissist's cruelty was never accurate prophecy about their worth. It was confession. Cruel people reveal themselves far more than they reveal their victims. The insults, the devaluation, the calculated indifference, these things emerged not from your inadequacy but from their inner famine. Healthy souls do not delight in diminishing others. A man standing in sunlight has no obsession with extinguishing candles. And so your healing gradually removes the poisonous interpretations you once carried. You stop viewing yourself through the narcissist's distorted lens. The accusations lose authority. The shame begins dissolving. You recognize that love should not require the constant abandonment of selfhood. This realization changes future relationships too. The healed person becomes slower to worship charm and quicker to notice character. They learn that kindness without consistency is manipulation in disguise. They begin valuing peace above intensity, honesty above flattery, steadiness above spectacle. The soul, having survived deception, develops a deeper appetite for truth, and truth has a curious effect upon darkness. It exposes it effortlessly. The narcissist often attempts to re-enter the lives of those who have healed, not always because of love indeed. Genuine love requires humility they have rarely cultivated, but because healed people possess something irresistibly attractive: independence. Once they sense they no longer dominate your emotions, their interest may mysteriously revive. The discarded object has become desirable again precisely because it escaped control. Yet the healed soul sees differently now. Where once they saw charisma, they now detect insecurity wrapped in grandiosity. Where once they saw confidence, they now recognize avoidance. Where once they interpreted unpredictability as passion, they now understand it as instability. The spell weakens under the light of understanding. And this, perhaps, is the narcissist's deepest punishment: not your hatred, not your revenge, but your indifference. To be emotionally irrelevant to someone they once controlled feels unbearable because it confronts them with the one reality they spend their lives evading. They are not omnipotent. They cannot permanently define another human being. They cannot ultimately prevent growth. They cannot stop a wounded soul from becoming wise. Your healing becomes evidence that their power had limits all along. Yet there is another dimension to this transformation, one even more profound. Suffering, if met honestly, often enlarges the heart. The person who has endured manipulation becomes capable of recognizing hidden pain in others. They grow gentler, not weaker, more discerning, not colder. They learn compassion without surrendering boundaries. In this way, the very wounds intended to destroy them become instruments through which they understand humanity more deeply. This is one of the great mysteries of existence. Evil frequently overreaches itself. In attempting to diminish the soul, it sometimes awakens strengths that comfort never could have produced. The narcissist sought admiration, but your healing produced wisdom. They sought obedience, but your suffering produced discernment. They sought to leave you empty, but the long journey through grief taught you what truly matters. And so the discarded person eventually stands in a strange place, indeed not grateful for the cruelty. Certainly, for cruelty remains evil even when good emerges afterward, but grateful that the cruelty did not succeed in making them cruel also. For that is the final temptation after betrayal, to become what wounded you. Some succumb to it. They build walls so high no love can enter. They turn suspicion into identity. They mistake numbness for healing. But the truly restored soul chooses another path. They remain open to goodness without becoming naive about darkness. They learn caution without surrendering tenderness. And that balance is far rarer than cynicism. The narcissist seldom achieves such balance because self-worship prevents self-knowledge. One cannot heal what one refuses to examine. And narcissism, at its core, is a desperate refusal to confront the ordinary fragility of being human. It constructs elaborate illusions of superiority precisely because the truth feels intolerable. But healing requires the opposite posture. It requires surrender to truth. The healed person admits their wounds, their mistakes, their misplaced hopes, their ignored instincts. And because they face reality honestly, reality eventually becomes less terrifying. They no longer need elaborate performances to protect their ego. They become grounded, authentic, free. Freedom unnerves those who survive by manipulation, for manipulation depends upon confusion. It thrives where people doubt their perceptions, distrust their instincts, and hunger endlessly for external validation. The healed soul gradually abandons these dependencies. They no longer beg to be chosen by those incapable of cherishing them. They no longer interpret abandonment as proof of unworthiness. Instead, they begin asking a far wiser question: what kind of arson discards love so carelessly in the first place? And once that question settles fully into the mind, the entire narrative changes. The wounded person once stood beneath the narcissist's judgment as though beneath the verdict of a god. Every criticism seemed absolute. Every withdrawal of affection felt like exile. Such is the terrible power of emotional manipulation. It persuades ordinary human beings that another flawed creature possesses authority over their entire sense of self. But time, truth, and suffering have a way of dismantling false thrones. Eventually, the soul awakens to the astonishing realization that the one whose approval seemed indispensable was himself profoundly disordered. And this realization alters everything. One no longer remembers the relationship merely through the lens of longing. One begins noticing the endless contradictions that were once excused in the name of love. How strange it was that the narcissist demanded understanding while offering so little of it in return. How peculiar that they preached loyalty while constantly creating insecurity. how exhausting it became to navigate conversations where accountability evaporated whenever it approached, and ched them personally. The healed soul sees now that much of the relationship was built upon inversion. Truth became distortion, kindness became weakness, boundaries became selfishness, and meanwhile selfishness itself masqueraded as strength. The victim was trained to doubt their own perceptions until confusion became a permanent climate. But confusion cannot survive forever in the presence of honest reflection. Little by little, memory rearranges itself properly. The fog lifts. Events once blamed upon personal inadequacy begin appearing in their true shape. The silent treatments were not maturity. The unpredictable affection was not passion. The endless criticism was not guidance. It was domination disguised in respectable clothing. There are few experiences more unsettling than realizing one has mistaken captivity for love. And yet there is also liberation hidden within such discovery. For once illusion collapses, one no longer needs to spend precious energy defending it. The mind grows quieter. The body, once tense with perpetual vigilance, begins to rest. Even the face changes. Many who survive narcissistic relationships discover that exhaustion had settled into their feet. Yaw so gradually they scarcely noticed it until peace returned. Peace itself becomes unfamiliar at first. A soul accustomed to emotional chaos often mistrusts calmness. Silence feels suspicious. Stability seems boring. One almost waits for disaster to emerge from behind ordinary moments. Such habits do not vanish overnight because survival teaches the nervous system terrible lessons. When affection and pain have long been intertwined, serenity can feel undeserved or unreal. But healing persists patiently. The restored person slowly learns that love does not need to wound in order to feel intense. They learn that respect is not coldness, that consistency is not dullness, and that genuine affection does not require endless tests of endurance. Indeed, one of the saddest truths about narcissistic relationships is that they train people to associate suffering with significance. The greater the pain, the more meaningful the attachment appears. Yet love is not measured by how much misery one can survive. A starving man may cling desperately to crumbs, but desperation does not transform crumbs into a feast. The narcissist, however, often depends upon this confusion. They create chanel scarcity so that ordinary decency feels extraordinary when it occasionally appears. A brief compliment after weeks of criticism becomes intoxicating. A moment of tenderness after cruelty feels like salvation. Thus the victim grows increasingly grateful for things that should never have required gratitude at all. Healing restores proportion. One begins seeing that basic kindness is not miraculous. Respect is not a reward to be earned through self-erasure. Emotional safety is not excessive to desire. These realizations sound simple when spoken aloud, yet for the wounded soul they arrive like revelations carved into stone. And while the healed person is rebuilding inwardly, the narcissist often continues moving outwardly from one distraction to another. New admirers, new performances, new attempts to outrun the emptiness that follows them faithfully from room to room. For narcissism is ultimately restless. It cannot remain still long enough to encounter itself honestly. This is why such individuals frequently appear energetic yet profoundly weary beneath the surface. They exhaust themselves maintaining illusions. Every interaction becomes theater. Every relationship becomes transaction. Even generosity may conceal hidden calculations. Who is admiring me? Who is validating me? Who is useful to me? The tragedy is not merely that they wound others. The tragedy is that they rarely experience genuine intimacy themselves. For intimacy requires mutual vulnerability, and vulnerability terrifies the narcissistic mind. To be truly known would risk exposing inadequacy, fear, and ordinary human weakness, the very things their grandiosity exists to conceal. Thus they construct identities like elaborate masks, convincing even themselves at times that the performance is real. But no mask can embrace another soul. And so, despite all their charm, many narcissists remain inwardly isolated. They may collect attention yet starve for connection. They may inspire fascination yet fail to inspire trust. People are drawn toward them initially, then gradually drained by the endless imbalance that follows. The healed person eventually understands that the narcissist's discard was never evidence of superior discernment. It was merely the predictable consequence of emotional incapacity. One cannot cherish what one fundamentally does not know how to value. A man blind to be. Beauty may walk through gardens unmoved. This understanding dissolves much unnecessary shame. For victims often torment themselves wondering why they were abandoned, replaced, or devalued. They search feverishly for flaws that might explain the narcissist's behavior, unaware that such behavior frequently repeats itself across countless relationships. The pattern is the point: idealization, devaluation, discard, return, admiration, criticism, withdrawal, pursuit. The cycle continues because the inner emptiness remains unresolved, and no external relationship can permanently fill an internal void. Meanwhile, the one who suffered begins discovering a different kind of fullness altogether. Not the loud exhilaration of emotional extremes, but something steadier: self-respect, clarity, inner quiet. These things emerge gradually, like dawn spreading across a landscape once hidden in darkness. One notices small changes first. The compulsion to explain oneself weakens. The fear of displeasing others loses some of its grip. One becomes more comfortable saying no without drowning afterward in guilt. The healed person stops volunteering for emotional crucifixion simply to preserve temporary peace. This transformation often confuses people who benefited from their former compliance. Those accustomed to manipulating kindness interpret boundaries as cruelty because boundaries interrupt exploitation. The healed soul may therefore face accusations of selfishness merely for refusing to continue self-betrayal, but maturity eventually teaches an essential lesson. Not everyone upset by your boundaries is wronged by them. Some are merely inconvenienced. And what remarkable freedom arrives when one no longer mistakes every accusation for truth. The narcissist cannot easily tolerate this new strength because it removes the mechanisms through which control once operated. Guilt loses effectiveness. Fear loses potency. Emotional baiting produces less reaction. The healed person no longer rushes desperately to repair conflicts they did not create. This is profoundly destabilizing for manipulative individuals. They depended upon your emotional labor the way parasites depend upon a host. Your empathy supplied energy. Your patience absorbed consequences. Your willingness to self-blame preserved their innocence. Once these resources disappear, they are forced either to confront themselves or seek new sources elsewhere. Most choose the latter, for self-confrontation is among the hardest tasks any human being can undertake. It requires humility, and humility is precisely what narcissism resists most fiercely. To admit wrongdoing would threaten the grandiose identity they have spent years constructing. Thus they rewrite history instead. Former partners become crazy, ungrateful, jealous, or toxic. Rarely do they ask whether repeated relational destruction might reveal something about their own character, but reality possesses stubborn endurance. One may deny gravity for years, yet the fall still comes. And often the narcissist's greatest punishment is not dramatic catastrophe but repetition. The same emptiness revisited endlessly, the same shallow victories, the same temporary admirers followed by eventual disillusionment, the same inability to sustain genuine closeness. Life becomes circular, not transformative. The healed soul, by contrast, moves forward, not perfectly, certainly. Healing is rarely linear. Old wounds sometimes ache unexpectedly. Memories return uninvited. Certain songs, places, or seasons may still stir grief, but grief no longer governs the entire landscape. It becomes weather rather than identity. This distinction matters immensely, for there is a danger in making suffering the center of one's self-concept. Some people remain psychologically chained to those who hurt them because pain becomes their primary narrative. Every conversation circles back to betrayal. Every thought feeds resentment. In attempting to preserve evidence of their wounds, they unintentionally preserve attachment to the wounder as well. True healing eventually loosens even this bond. One begins investing emotional energy not merely in surviving the past, but in building the future. New friendships deepen. Forgotten talents reawaken. The world regains color. One discovers that life had not ended with the discard, it had merely passed through fire. And fire changes things. Wood either burns into ash or hardens into something capable of enduring greater heat. The soul likewise emerges altered by suffering. Some become bitter, suspicious of all goodness thereafter. Others become wiser without surrendering hope. The difference often lies in whether pain led them toward truth or merely toward self-protection. The healed person chooses truth. Truth about what love is and is not. Truth about what they tolerated. Truth about their own wounds that made manipulation possible. For narcissists do not create insecurities from nothing, they exploit fractures already present. Perhaps the victim feared abandonment long before the relationship began. Perhaps they learned in childhood to earn affection through overgiving. Perhaps they confused being needed with being valued. Healing therefore becomes more than recovery from one individual. It becomes reconciliation with oneself. This inner reconciliation is powerful because it removes the desperation that manipulators exploit. A person who knows their worth cannot easily be seduced by intermittent validation. A person comfortable with solitude will not cling to harmful company merely to avoid loneliness. A person rooted in truth becomes difficult to control through illusion. And illusions are the narcissist's primary language. Notice how often appearances mattered above substance, how much energy was devoted to image, reputation, admiration, performance. The narcissist may spend years cultivating the appearance of virtue while neglecting virtue itself. They crave being perceived as loving more than actually loving, appearing wise more than pursuing wisdom, seeming powerful more than developing integrity. But appearances eventually crack beneath sustained reality. One cannot forever pretend to possess qualities one refuses to cultivate inwardly. Sooner or later, relationships reveal character. Stress reveals character. Time reveals character. And while charm may captivate briefly, consistency exposes what charm conceals. The healed soul comes to value consistency immensely. Not grand declarations, but reliable actions. Not intoxicating intensity, but steady care. Not manipulation disguised as romance, but mutual respect strong enough to survive honesty. They become less impressed by charisma and more attentive to character. This shift alone protects them from countless future wounds. For many narcissists rely upon acceleration. They overwhelm targets quickly with attention, promises, emotional intimacy, and idealization before discernment has time to awaken. But the healed person grows slower now, more observant. They understand that trustworthy people do not pressure others into abandoning caution. Genuine affection can withstand patience, and patience reveals truth. How many red flags become visible only after urgency fades? The inability to apologize sincerely, the subtle contempt hidden beneath jokes, the endless need for admiration, the inability to celebrate others without redirecting attention toward oneself, the pattern of former relationships mysteriously ending with everyone else blamed. The healed soul notices these things now because suffering sharpened perception. There is sorrow in that sharpening, certainly. Innocence rarely survives betrayal unchanged. Yet wisdom emerges in its place, and wisdom is no small gift. It allows a person to move through the world with clearer sight, less vulnerable to deception, more anchored in reality. Meanwhile, the narcissist often mistakes this clarity for coldness. They cannot comprehend why former tactics no longer succeed, why guilt fails, why charm feels hollow, why emotional games provoke distance instead of pursuit. The healed person has changed languages internally. They no longer translate manipulation into love. And perhaps this is why healing becomes punishment without ever intending revenge. Your peace confronts their chaos. Your authenticity confronts their performance. Your growth confronts their stagnation. Most unsettling of all, your continued existence without their approval confronts the central lie they believed about themselves, that they were indispensable to your identity. But no human being was meant to occupy that place. When we place another person at the center of our worth, we burden them with a role no mortal can sustain rightly. Some collapse beneath it, others exploit it. The narcissist exploits it eagerly because worship feeds the false self they have constructed. Yet eventually the worshipper awakens, and awakening always threatens false gods. The healed person no longer kneels emotionally before those who diminish them. They understand now that love requiring self-abandonment is not love at all but captivity dressed in sentimental language. And once this truth settles deeply enough into the soul, one cannot entirely return to former blindness. There may still be moments of sadness, of course. Healing does not erase history. Certain wounds leave scars, and scars are not signs of failure. They are reminders that pain was survived. The goal was never to become untouched. The goal was to become whole again. And despite being touched by cruelty, wholeness looks different after suffering. It is quieter than innocence, stronger too. The healed person becomes less concerned with being admired and more concerned with living truthfully. They no longer exhaust themselves auditioning for affection. They cease shrinking to fit the insecurities of others. And in this freedom, they often discover something extraordinary. The life waiting beyond manipulation is far larger than the prison they once mistook for destiny. Even joy changes quality after such experiences. It becomes less naive but more meaningful. A peaceful evening carries profound gratitude because one remembers what constant tension felt like. Honest conversation feels sacred because deception once poisoned communication. Safety becomes beautiful precisely because chaos once seemed normal. The narcissist rarely understands this richness because their lives remain externally driven. They chase stimulation while the healed soul cultivates depth, and depth cannot be imitated indefinitely. It reveals itself in patience, empathy, accountability, steadiness, and the quiet confidence of someone no longer desperate to prove their value. That quiet confidence unsettles manipulative people profoundly, for manipulation depends upon insecurity. If you no longer hunger for their validation, their influence weakens. If you no longer fear abandonment, threats lose force. If you trust your own perceptions, gaslighting fails. The healed soul becomes emotionally sovereign, and sovereignty is difficult to dominate. So the narcissist may attempt one final strategy, rewriting your transformation as evidence of their own importance. They may claim your growth happened because of them, as though cruelty deserves credit for the strength it failed to destroy. But suffering alone does not ennoble anyone. Many suffer and grow crueler. What transformed you was not merely pain, but the courageous decision to face pain honestly rather than inflict it upon others. That decision is profoundly moral. For every wounded person stands eventually at a crossroads. One path leads toward bitterness, cynicism, and repetition of harm. The other leads toward wisdom, compassion, and hard-earned clarity. The healed soul chooses the second path repeatedly, often quietly, without applause. And in doing so they accomplish something the narcissist never expected possible. They become more fully themselves than before the wound ever occurred. For there is a peculiar strength born only in those who have suffered deception and yet refuse to become deceptive themselves. Such people carry an invisible gravity. They no longer speak with the frantic urgency of those trying to convince the world of their worth. They have already survived the collapse of false love, and once one survives such collapse, many lesser fears lose their dominion. The healed soul begins moving through life differently, not louder but steadier. They no longer mistake attention for affection. They no longer interpret emotional intensity as proof of depth. Indeed, they often become suspicious of anything that demands immediate surrender of trust, because they have learned that truth does not fear examination. How strange it is that the narcissist once interpreted your gentleness as weakness. They believed your patience meant you could be endlessly bent without breaking. They mistook your willingness to understand for permission to wound. Yet what they failed to grasp was that kindness possesses a strength cruelty can never fully comprehend. Cruelty is always fragile beneath its armor. It requires constant defense, constant justification, constant performance. The cruel person must endlessly protect themselves from self-awareness, for even a brief, honest glance inward might unravel the entire illusion upon which their identity depends. This is why narcissists often react to criticism with such disproportionate fury. The criticism itself is not the true threat. The threat is exposure. But the healed person no longer fears exposure in the same way. Having faced grief, shame, confusion, loneliness, and disappointment, they become more capable of honesty with themselves. They can admit mistakes without collapsing. They can acknowledge wounds without turning those wounds into weapons against others. This humility grants them a freedom unavailable to the narcissist, who remains imprisoned inside the exhausting task of appearing superior. And superiority is a lonely throne. One cannot genuinely connect with people one secretly views as inferior, useful, or disposable. Thus, the narcissist often stands surrounded by acquaintances yet inwardly starving for something real. They may inspire envy from afar while living in profound emotional poverty up close. The healed soul eventually sees this tragedy clearly, not with romanticized pity that excuses abuse, but with sober understanding. One recognizes that narcissism itself is a kind of spiritual starvation. The narcissist consumes admiration because they cannot nourish themselves internally. They demand control because inwardly they feel powerless. They seek worship because they cannot tolerate ordinary humanity. But ordinary humanity is precisely where authentic love lives, in mutual imperfection, in accountability, in patience, in the willingness to say, "I was wrong," in the courage to remain truthful even when truth bruises pride. The narcissist often avoids these sacred ordinary acts because they threaten the grandiose image so carefully maintained. The healed person, however, becomes increasingly comfortable with authenticity. They stop curating themselves for universal approval. They realize that being misunderstood is survivable. They discover that peace is worth more than performance. This discovery changes not only relationships but identity itself. For years, perhaps they lived reactively, organizing their emotions around another person's moods, criticisms, or desires. Their inner world became occupied territory. Every decision filtered through anticipated judgment, every joy measured against possible disapproval. But healing reorders the soul. One begins asking different questions, not, will this make me acceptable, but, is this true? Is this healthy? Is this worthy of the life I have been given? Such questions mark the return of self-respect, and self-respect terrifies manipulators because it cannot easily be negotiated away. The healed person no longer bargains with their own dignity merely to preserve attachment. They understand now that loneliness, while painful, is far less destructive than intimacy poisoned by contempt. There comes a moment in healing when the narcissist's opinion loses its sacred authority. Their insults begin sounding repetitive rather than prophetic. Their approval loses its intoxicating power. One sees at last that a person incapable of loving consistently was never qualified to define another's worth. This realization feels almost like waking from enchantment. The world sharpens, colors return. One notices how much life had been spent surviving instead of living, and grief appears gain then, but in a different form, not grief for the narcissist alone, but grief for the self that endured so much unnecessary suffering believing it was love. Yet even this grief becomes transformative, for it softens the heart toward one's own humanity. The healed person learns not merely to forgive others wisely, but to forgive themselves as well. To forgive the years spent begging for crumbs, to forgive the ignored instincts, to forgive the desperate hope that love might eventually emerge from someone committed primarily to control. Self-forgiveness is often harder than forgiving others, but it is necessary because shame keeps the soul chained to the past just as effectively as bitterness does. Healing requires release from both. And once released, the person discarded by the narcissist often becomes unexpectedly radiant, not because suffering made them flawless, but because suffering stripped away illusions. They become more real, more grounded, less easily seduced by appearances. They value sincerity over charm, substance over spectacle, peace over emotional theatrics. The narcissist never expected this. They expected ruin. They expected endless longing. They expect their absence to become the defining tragedy of your existence. Instead, their absence became the space in which you rediscovered yourself, and perhaps the deepest irony of all is this. The narcissist often spent the relationship trying to convince you that you were inadequate, while all along your capacity for growth exceeded theirs entirely. For growth belongs to those willing to confront truth, and truth demands humility. The narcissist rejected humility in order to preserve ego. You embraced humility in order to recover your soul. That is why you healed while they remained trapped inside the same repeating cycles. Not because you were spared pain, but because you allowed pain to teach you instead of harden you completely. You chose awareness over denial, responsibility over blame, depth over performance. And these choices, though invisible at first, reshape an entire life. The healed soul eventually understands that survival was never the final goal. One was not merely meant to escape manipulation, but to become fully alive afterward, to laugh without fear, to love without worshipping, to stand without apology in the truth of one's own worth. And once a person reaches hat place inwardly, the narcissist's greatest weapon disappears forever. For the one thing manipulators can never truly control is a soul that no longer needs their permission to exist. And so, in the end, the narcissist did not lose because you exposed them, defeated them, or destroyed them. They lost because you survived them without becoming them. They expected your spirit to remain buried beneath the weight of their rejection, yet the very pain meant to erase you became the fire through which your soul was refined. What they intended as your ending became the strange beginning of your awakening. For a person who has truly healed no longer measures life by who abandoned them, but by what truth they discovered afterward. And the truth is this: your worth was never hanging in the hands of someone too wounded to love properly. Your value did not decrease because another person failed to recognize it. A blind man does not diminish the sun by refusing to see it. The narcissist will continue searching for mirrors, for applause, for substitutes capable of silencing the emptiness within. But you who walked through grief honestly, who endured confusion without surrendering your humanity, who learned to rebuild your life upon truth rather than illusion, you have found something infinitely more precious than revenge. You found yourself, and there is no punishment greater for the narcissist than witnessing the person they tried to break become peaceful, whole, and free without them. Not bitter, not begging, not haunted. Free. Because in the end, the discarded soul discovered what the narcissist never could. That genuine power is not found in controlling others, but in mastering oneself, not in being worshipped, but in becoming real, not in forcing love to stay, but in becoming someone no cruelty can permanently destroy. And when such a soul finally rises from the ashes of manipulation, carrying wisdom where wounds once lived, even heaven itself seems to whisper the same quiet truth. What was meant to ruin you became the very thing that revealed your strength.